Voted the world's best airline by Business Traveller magazine in both 1988 and 1989. Awarded the Silver Globe by Travel News as best airline for 4 consecutive years. The 25 million passengers it carried during the past year encouraged British Airways to describe itself as the world's favourite airline. These are the cosmetics on the public face of British Airways. But what lies underneath? As the dramatic change in the fortunes of British Airways benefited the airline consumer as much as it's benefited those who bought shares in the airline 3 years ago. The story of British Airways in the 80s is inextricably linked with the story of one man, Lord King of Waternaby, appointed chairman of British Airways in September 1980. Millionaire entrepreneur, close friend of royalty and cabinet ministers, arguably the most charismatic businessman in Britain today.
I was talking to Lawson when he first started.
A man who delights in being different, travelling London streets in his own chauffeur-driven taxicab. Rumours pursue him. In 1989, the tabloid press had him moving to be chairman of British Rail, or headhunted to run Pan Am.
Well, are these pages numbered?
Yep.
On the day of the British Airways annual general meeting, Lord King receives a final briefing in his Mayfair flat.
The revised questions, I don't think there's a need for any more.
If they ask this lot, we'll be there till next year.
Yeah. Well, we're finding some questions on salaries right from the top to the bottom, but they're easy to handle by international comparisons.
Well, I'll tell you, they're a fact, so we can deal with them.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your chairman of the Honourable Lord King of Waternaby.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to your 1989...
As well as declaring pre-tax profits of £268 million and a dividend to shareholders of nearly 8p a share, he announced his own pay rise of 116%, bringing his annual salary to £385,000, in sharp contrast to BA staff, who received a 6% rise. Questioned by shareholders, Lord King defended his pay increase with customary vigour.
It's your company. Your company. We're running it. We have a properly constituted committee of non-executive directors who look at this whole question of pay and what is available. I'd rather like to hang on to him, by the way. He could get more, and I'll bet you could if you wanted to. So it's a free world. Now, my justification is that we're trying to run this company for you, profitably and well, and we are there doing that. If you don't want us to be paid at all, well, we'll do some other job. I've answered your question. I have another question. Two more. I've got two more, and I really must deal with the resolution. Go on.
May I just add one further point to what you've just said, and I've made careful note of your comments there.
Well, now, in saying you've made careful notes of my comments, is it a threat?
No, it's not a threat.
Because it's a matter of record.
I would suggest that in 1988, your staff were rewarded for that loyalty with a 5.5% pay increase. For this year, we are receiving the princely sum of 6%. I find this just does not, there's no correlation between your comments about loyalty and your staff.
Well, now, let me tell you this. The staff of British Airways are loyal even if they thought that I wasn't treating them properly. Now, don't question the loyalty of British Airways staff, because that is not a fact. Another question. I've dealt with you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen.
Where is he?
My name is...
Lord King doesn't just earn £385,000 a year from British Airways. At the time of last year's annual general meeting, he was also being paid £387,000 a year as chairman of the engineering company FKI Babcock. After his 116% BA rise, this brought his total salary to in excess of £770,000 a year.
116%, the magic isn't 116. 116 on zero doesn't come to very much. I mean, you know, don't get the percentages mixed up.
Oh, no, I'm not. It's about £350,000 for...
That's right.
For a, it's a, what is it, part-time job, isn't it?
No, it's not. What's part-time about it?
Well, it's not your only position.
It's not my only position, but I happen to be a director of a number of other companies, and so is everyone else that I know. I need to have a window to the rest of the world, you know. It's not part-time. Try it. Try it. 7 a.m., midnight, most days of the week, on call every day. And I'm not talking about the factory floor. This is one of the problems, you know, that you worry about success. Mr. Sisson's one of your announcers. Is he part-time? Come on. So it's quite all right if you're an artist, snooker player, actor, radio, television broadcaster, Hugh. That's fine. Earn as much as you like. It's great. But be related to the factory floor. Then, in England, we have a little problem about that.
Before Lord King was made chairman, British Airways had gigantic problems. In the late 70s, BA had 17 separate trade unions and a never-ending series of industrial disputes. Costs rose dramatically. Fuel prices doubled in 1979 alone. The airline was heavily overmanned, overmanning that had its origins in the merger in 1974 of two separate airlines, BOAC and BEA. The merged airline had a notorious PR problem. Some newspapers said BA stood not for British Airways, but for bloody awful. This was the troubled world into which Mrs. Thatcher sent her troubleshooter, the then Sir John King, who took over at BA in February 1981. He set about making his formidable presence felt. His brief sought the airline out for privatization. When he has a problem to think through, Lord King comes here to his country seat, a few thousand acres in the heart of rural Leicestershire. As well as the farm, he owns extensive gardens, which now and then he opens to the public for charity. Relatively new to the role of country squire, Lord King leaves discreet reminders of his presence. His country house is one of the few in England to boast a private cricket ground. This is the home of the Lord King 11, the cricket team which was previously the Sir John King 11, and which was ennobled, along with him, in 1983. The president of the Lord King 11 is, not surprisingly, Lord King. As president, he's afforded certain privileges. Before taking over BA, Lord King was a highly successful businessman with a background in heavy engineering. Why, at the age of 63, did he take on an ailing British Airways?
The desire, the will, and the little bit of vanity that goes with wanting to be successful if you've said you'll do it. No different to these fellas playing cricket, you know. They want to hit 6. It's quite simple stuff.
doesn't it? The two former...
Lord King's second wife is the Honourable Isabel Monckton, daughter of the Viscount Galway, a woman with one of the most aristocratic pedigrees in Europe.
Take one, take two, take 20.
They mustn't get more than 99.
No, it's okay. It's all in control.
Confidence.
It's in control.
Yeah.
99, is this what you want?
That's...
Lord King briefs the Lord King 11 on what he requires of them. He's famous as a motivator. Was it that quality that was most needed at British Airways?
Well, I think I was asked to run it because the powers that be thought that I had some skills in administering business and dealing with people. And they cast their bread on the water, and it's come home.
Lord King is surprisingly reticent about his past. His Who's Who entry lists few clues to his background. The truth is, he was brought up in humble circumstances in the tiny village of Dunsfold near Guildford. The King family used to live in a rented cottage next to the pub. By today's standards, John King had little formal schooling, and by the age of 16 he joined the many at a nearby factory who were filing clamping stays for Goblin vacuum cleaners. Les Brooks was a workmate.
Clamping Stay King. That's what they called him. Clamping Stay King. Appropriate, his name, wasn't it? That's it, look. All he used to do is part it off, put it down. That's all. And turn it round later on, put the thread on the other end, finished. He wasn't afraid of anything. He was that type of fella. You know, he didn't care about anybody. Well, he did care, but he wasn't afraid of anybody or anything. That was the type of man he was, fella he was.
By the time John King married his first wife in 1940, he'd escaped Nelco's, and thanks to his father-in-law, Arthur Sykes, a self-made businessman, he'd set up in business at the back of Sykes' house. Still in his mid-20s, he was already master of his own destiny. For much of the war, he made munitions here in this small shed. He was never to work for someone else again. In 1945, he was able to start up a small engineering company at Ferrybridge, near Pontefract in Yorkshire. Lord King sold the factory 20 years ago, but he and his family are not forgotten. All over the site, there are King foundation stones. The factory initially made pens, specializing in the King pen, but a few years later changed to the manufacture of ball bearings. Lord King's not forgotten by those he employed. Eric Guy began working for him in the 50s.
We liked him. He brought this business into this area, and for that, we're very grateful. Watch out. John King's about, as we used to say. We always called him John L up here. And you could always tell he was about. He smoked a cigar. You could always smell a cigar a mile off. Yeah, you had to watch your step. You don't cross John King.
The staff of British Airways were quick to find that John King was not a man to be crossed when he took over the company in 1981. They were also about to learn that he loved to make an unforgettable first impression.
Well, John tells a story, which is one I remember and which I frequently tell without giving him the benefit of authorship, which is the story of the man who had a troublesome mule, the farmer, and he called in a man to help him train it. And the first thing the man did who came in to help was hit the mule over the head with a block of wood. And the farmer said, what are you doing that for? He said, I'm trying to attract his attention.
7 months into the job, King was about to stand British Airways on its head.
Good evening. 17 aircraft to be sold off, 9,000 jobs to go. It's the biggest shock in the history of the world's largest international airline. British Airways say if they don't take this action now, the airline could collapse.
The workforce was cut from 52 to 43,000. 10 months later, another 6,000 redundancies were announced. And it wasn't just on the shop floor. The changes and redundancies went right up to the BA board. 2 years into King's reign, only 5 of the board King had inherited were left. Despite the generous redundancy terms, there are those who believe Lord King's treatment of people bordered on the cruel.
I've no great patience with a man who calls someone in early in the morning and says he must be out the same day. I just got no time for that at all. The man's got a family, he's got his own prestige in his own local community and so forth, and one should do their utmost to cushion it. It's not as if the man is found with his hand in the till. That's a different proposition. But I have no patience with this sort of dismissing people and thinking it's being very big shot stuff and very, very sort of firm management. That's rubbish in my view.
Well, of course, you see, he's wrong. He's wrong. Wouldn't savage anybody. There was some criticism about the amount of redundancy pay that we gave. And I said, if you will tell me what you should say to a man by way of quantifying the amount when you tell him he hasn't got a job. Now, you tell me how much that is, then I'll know what you're talking about.
The passenger seat factor was 70.3%.
Lord King appointed his new chief executive, Colin Marshall, in February 1983. Now he had the board he wanted.
All of that is going to give us, for the fourth quarter of the financial year, an increase of 7% in revenue.
As chairman, Lord King dominated board meetings by sheer force of personality.
He didn't say much. He just introduced a paper and let somebody talk to it, and he'd spend most of his time looking at people intently. Not the person doing the talking, anybody. Gaze at them with those piercing eyes of his, sizing them up, finding out what made them tick, whether they're the sort of people he could depend on, whether they were all gloss and show. But I recall one incident when a well-known industrialist asked some question about, some smallish question about standards of service on the aircraft, and he was told in no uncertain terms to shut up and mind his own business. In fact, he was a board member put there by the government, by the Secretary of State, didn't seem to count two hoots.
Having sold the seats, we don't have the airplanes.
Well, there is that element of risk. Unfortunately, we are still quite a long way ahead of when we're expecting to introduce them into the fleet.
The passenger list of this special Concorde flight to Moscow reveals another major area of concern for Lord King, one in which he invests much time and money. The press. The deputy editor of the Sunday Times, the then editor of the Sunday Express, and other top journalists are flying free to Moscow, where BA even pays for their hotel rooms. Just part of the £5 million a year BA spends on PR, controlled by Director of Public Affairs, David Burnside.
Davis, Nicholas Soames is important to us. Yeah. For Crawley, he's been very constructive. I thought slightly opposed to us in the early days of the Caledonian takeover, but I think he understands that we've done a proper job there. Very loyal.
And what does BA expect in return for its assiduous hospitality to journalists?
They don't have to write nice things, but if they write things that are correct and constructive, then for my part, because of our performance, I know they'll be quite proper and sensible to read.
And if they write something that you don't like, would you not ask them back again?
I'd rather, you know, would I ask them back again? Yes. Give them a new opportunity to see the light.
One who refused to see the light was independent radio journalist and aviation correspondent of the Daily Mail, Paul Maurice. He wrote articles that were critical of Lord King and British Airways. BA never tried to sue him, but found other ways of showing its displeasure.
Very soon afterwards, I got a letter from Mr. Burnside, who's the Public Relations or Public Affairs Director of the airline, saying that I was no longer to be accepted in the fold. I was to be banned, excommunicated again, and that both he and Lord King and indeed Sir Colin Marshall had agreed that that was the right thing to do. I would personally have preferred them to take some sort of legal action, because then I could have proved the worth of my stories in the court of law, rather than this sort of arbitrary ban which leaves me no recourse at all. Well, it means that I'm not invited to any of the press conferences. I'm not allowed to interview any of the senior executives. I'm not, for instance, permitted to go to some airline factories where they're about to buy aircraft.
Whether British Airways or any of the staff would wish to cooperate and be helpful to someone who was unhelpful is nothing more than what happens in life, whatever the walk of life or sphere you're in.
Colin, good morning, how are you?
Every morning at 7:30, Lord King rings Sir Colin Marshall to check on the day's events. They've been working together since 1983, and almost at once were recognised as a formidable partnership.
Yeah, I've looked through it but haven't read it.
Together, they hoped by 1984 that the airline would be fit for privatisation. But then in July of that year, they ran into a major obstacle.
British Airways has been told it's too big, and the airline will have to hand over some of its routes to independent operators. A report from the Civil Aviation Authority says there must be more competition before the state-owned company is privatised. It claims the changes would help the industry develop and mean cheaper fares.
In essence, the report from the CAA, the aviation industry's independent watchdog, was designed to make British Caledonian an effective competitor with British Airways by giving Caledonian some of BA's routes. This, it was argued, would give more choice to the airline traveller. It was also felt that without the extra routes, BCAL would be in trouble once BA was released from government control.
I'm very pleased with the report in general terms. It's the most sweeping report about civil aviation since the end of the Second World War, and it will bring more competition into the industry. It will give the independent airlines a bigger role to play. It will be very good for the consumer.
The CAA clearly felt that BCAL needed help.
The whole idea was to enable the industry to continue on the basis of there being more than one airline able to operate and indeed to be available to be substituted for British Airways whenever the need might arise, or when it would be in the interests of greater competition and the benefit of the travelling public.
All that I hung on to was the statement that was made in the House of Commons by John Nott and further by Norman Tebbit and then by their successors, that in the privatisation of British Airways there would be no arbitrary transfer of routes. So the company they gave me, they said the routes would remain intact. So that was the company we were looking at, and that was the company we were going to privatise. Now, to come along later on and say, well, we'd like you to give half of it away, I didn't go for that at all. But what was working for me was the government's stated policy that it would not do it.
A pipe band led a protest march by British Airways employees to hand in a petition at Downing Street today.
There were marches. Lord King lobbied cabinet ministers. MPs were wined and dined. One senior backbencher described the lobbying as unbelievable.
I think he's used his lobbying experience in a way which I think is almost a model of lobbying. And if one wants to question the morality of lobbying, which one may or may not wish to do, I mean, one cannot deny the fact that the lobbying has been highly successful, and John has been more successful than anybody else I know.
It was a big fight, though, wasn't it? You, at the time, I think, threatened to resign.
No, I did not. I did not. And if I've said it once, I've said it half a dozen times. I was asked if I would resign if it went against me. And I said, I accept resignations, I don't offer them. And all that was ever said. So I don't intend to resign. You mustn't threaten.
The battle over air routes between British Airways and British Caledonian has been sorted out by the government, and it looks as if British Airways has won. The result means the airline remains an attractive proposition for privatisation.
The CAA report was effectively ignored. The CAA were quoted as being disappointed. But BA seemed set fair for privatization. There was just one final obstacle. Sir Freddie Laker and Laker Airways. The SkyTrain had been offering cheap flights across the Atlantic since the 70s. Laker had been taking on the big airlines and winning. But then, in February 1982, it all started to go fatally wrong.
The best suggestion I can give you is really to go home, because I couldn't tell you exactly...
Sir Freddie and his lawyers claimed it was an illegal cartel of airlines, including British Airways, that had put him out of business.
On the indicator boards, the name Laker was simply no longer there.
Freddie Laker had as much of a chance as anyone could dream of having. A knight, an internationally famous figure, highly successful, very well-financed airline, operating an enormous number of flights, and he was put out of business. No one else dares try.
Even though BA still denies it conspired to put him out of business, the Laker suit was eventually settled in August 1985. Sir Freddie accepted an $8 million payoff, and the Laker creditors were compensated. At last, the way was clear for privatization.
I've got a plane to catch. My case. Your case, sir. Won't you? I must fly.
No wonder British Airways is the world's favorite airline.
We break these 4 phases down: super care, financial success campaign, stimulating desire, and of course the action period, where the investor actually takes the decision to buy shares in British Airways.
The flotation was finally launched on February the 11th, 1987, at 65 pence for the first instalment on each share. The offer was oversubscribed 11 times. BA was now free to concentrate its attention on its home competitors.
I've been all around this great big world, and I've flown with all kinds of girls. But I can't wait to get back to Gatwick, to the cutest girls in the world. I wish they all could be Caledonian. I wish they all could be Caledonian. I wish they all could be Caledonian girls.
As a great champion of free competition, why did you swallow up British Cow?
Swallow up British Cow? Yes, you have a rather novel way of phrasing your question. Swallow up. Gulp down. Now, British Caledonian was within a week of not being able to pay its wages. We wanted to buy British Caledonian because we wanted to expand. We represent our shareholders. We represent our business. We represent a strong British company. And there, just like anyone else, we want to grow our business.
I've never come across a businessman that did not pursue monopoly. I mean, what you pursue in business, in my experience, is the monopoly for yourself and maximum competition amongst your suppliers. And therefore, there's nothing wrong in any chairman or any company. Competition is about eliminating competitors, not about competition. That's what business is about. It is about the elimination of competitors. That's why we have regulatory bodies and stock exchange and government to ensure it doesn't get over the top. But it's the government's job to promote competition. In my experience, the business world actually tries to eliminate it.
But someone else was interested in BCAL. The Scandinavian airline, SAS, was prepared to pay £140 million for a quarter share in Caledonian. They believed they could have offered a better deal to the British consumer.
We would have been able to maintain competition in Britain, because as it went, the largest competitor to the flag carrier British Airways disappeared.
There was heavyweight opposition to the proposed SAS investment, not just in the British press, but in Parliament itself. And SAS were convinced that Lord King was behind it.
obviously he must have orchestrated some of this political opposition that came out. We know, at least I say I know, because I had the privilege of meeting quite a number of the people from the House of Commons in this venture, and several of them said very, very clearly to me that Lord King was strongly behind the politicians in this matter, pushing them in his direction.
Helga Lindeberg of SAS, who were favorites to get BCAL at one time, claims that it was political opposition that you orchestrated that ensured his airline's defeat.
It was money. I don't know who ever invented it. I believe it was the Phoenicians. And there's been no other solution since then.
As part of his lobbying, Lord King used his engineering contacts to ring Peter Wallenberg of SKF, the Swedish ball bearing company. The Wallenberg group of companies also happens to be one of the biggest private shareholders in SAS. The Swedes felt that these behind-the-scenes maneuvers came close to being intimidatory.
Whether it's legitimate or not is one question, but this will have to be a very personal opinion. The moral of it, I would question.
Why?
No, I mean, after all, we are Europeans. We do act in a certain fashion. We have a certain culture. I think this type of thing probably belongs on some other continent than ours.
Listen, I know Peter Wallenberg for years. I've been connected with him and through their family business and so on for years. What do you expect me to say to him?
What did you say?
I've forgotten. I asked him if he knew what he was doing. But I don't really see that that has any value, a question like that, really. You've said a number of times that I lean, or I might be leaned on. We're in a commercial business, dealing with staff and shareholders and passengers and things. We're not in Chicago in the 30s, you know.
Atlanta, Georgia. The 80s in America have been the decade of total domestic deregulation. The big American carriers, like Delta, operate out of hub airports, which are as commonplace as bus terminals. Any airline can try to fly anywhere at any price without any regulation, apart from meeting federal safety standards. Many domestic airfares are actually lower in real terms here than they were 10 years ago. Some major routes are half the price of the equivalent distances in Europe. Passenger trips have almost doubled. Since deregulation, competition has become so intense here in America that a book of fares is out of date before it's printed.
We published fares in the past, but it may come as a shock to you and some of your viewers to know that on any given day, it's not unlikely that we will have in this country 300,000 to 500,000 fares change in a single day, and we just simply could not keep up with the printing process if we had to print books of fares. I think it's been good for the consumer. We have a lot more people flying today than had ever been on airplanes in the past, and I think the reason for that is that through the free pricing efforts that we have with the various carriers, through fare wars, if you will, that more opportunities have been made to the entire public, and we're seeing a lot more people probably who used to take surface transportation are now flying on the airlines.
The U.S. Department of Transportation tries to make international routes just as competitive. Unlike Britain, an airline's claim here for a new route is examined by a judge in open court. Every route allocation is re-examined every 5 years. Consumer groups can be called as witnesses. The US government does not look enviously on BA's powerful position in our market.
Well, from our perspective, certainly the United States demands that we have more than one national carrier. I don't want to speak for any foreign government as to how they should organize themselves, but we would not find that acceptable for ourselves. As a matter of fact, I would just say that even on a particular route to one country, we always strive to have more than one US carrier on any particular route.
I saw Colin Marshall give a speech in Washington where he talked about the wonderful service British Airways provides, the seamless web, and I'm sure it is wonderful. But my mind went back almost 30 years to 1960, and in that case, British Airways said, "We provide wonderful service. The consumer has everything it can want. Competition is unnecessary." And there it was. Everything that we've seen, the Laker experience, all finished. We're back where we were 30 years ago.
Lord King visited Russia in April 1989. He finds much to reflect on in Moscow.
There's a tremendous history here. I mean, when you stand here in Red Square, I mean, for the want of a better word, you can feel the clout, can't you?
One of his significant calls in Moscow was to Aeroflot, the giant Soviet airline.
Yes. Hello from the Ministry of Aviation and from Minister Volkov.
Я сейчас с ним разговаривал только что.
So now you will be able to speak with the Vice Minister will be able to speak with you.
По телефону.
And he will speak.
One of the subjects under discussion was BA's proposal that they produce Aeroflot's in-flight magazine. Surprisingly, BA's chairman is something of a hit with the Russians.
We have a very good relationship with them and friendly within the limits of their system.
It's ironic that they should be fond of you when you're a lord and a capitalist, isn't it?
Well, there are less of us here.
Every international route that BA has is subject to separate negotiations between governments and their nominated airlines. The Russians operate some of the most restrictive controls on international flights. BA says it would prefer a world where there was open and free competition and an end to cozy arrangements between national airlines.
We're business people just like you. What else do you want us to do?
Yes, sad, but that's the truth.
У нас здесь сначала вот главный наш генеральный директор Шереметьево.
This is our general director at Sheremetyevo.
Он очень деньги считает уже не только на счетах, но и компьютер применяет.
He's very interested in money, of course.
Yes. Well, I'm sure that from the 30 years that we have been working together...
BA won't talk openly about exactly how they arrive at fares for particular routes, and they argue that landing fees and air traffic fees differ all over the world. But simple comparisons can be striking. You might think that every mile you flew in a BA plane would cost you roughly the same, wherever you flew. But you'd be wrong. The cheapest BA return flight on the highly competitive London to Los Angeles route is just £349. London to Rio is only slightly further, and like the BA routes into Russia, heavily regulated. The cheapest BA return ticket to Rio will cost you an amazing £771. There are varying restrictions on both these tickets. So is there a conflict between BA's duty to its shareholders and its service to its customers?
Well, there's bound to be a conflict, yes, because, I mean, if they're doing the right thing by the shareholders, it's not likely that they would also be flying many of these routes at the lowest possible fares. It's inevitable. I mean, if I were in the shoes of British Airways and wanting to optimize their balance sheet, then I don't think I would really welcome an over-liberal approach.
There is a great deal of competition in the industry. I've said this before. We have one route where we have no competition from the UK. That's Bermuda. And by the way, there's no competition there. There's not enough for one, let alone two.
Of course, there is American deregulated competition and the regulated Russian kind. At the British Embassy in Moscow, British Airways are a powerful presence at an important reception during the British Trade Fair. Guest of honor, the then Secretary of State for Energy, Cecil Parkinson. Mr. Parkinson is a personal friend of Lord King.
Good evening, pleased to meet you. Nice to see you. Good evening. That's right.
Hello, Cecil Parkinson.
After Cecil Parkinson left the cabinet over the Sarah Keys scandal, Lord King helped his friend get on the board of Babcock International plc, the engineering company of which he's chairman. Mr. Parkinson resigned from the board when he rejoined the cabinet in 1987.
No. Good to see you.
Cecil Parkinson and the rest of his ministry team travelled to Moscow as paying passengers on BA's Special Concorde. Since the trip, Cecil Parkinson's been made Secretary of State for Transport, the man with direct cabinet responsibility for British Airways. He is unequivocal about Lord King.
Well, I think he's been outstandingly successful. He took over a very unprofitable, heavily overmanned airline, which wasn't exactly a byword for quality and service. And if you go anywhere in the world now, British Airways is admired. It makes money. Its staff are contented. It's efficient. So I think he's done a very good job. I've known John for a number of years. He's never asked me as a minister for a favor. He wouldn't dream of presuming on a friendship in that way. Now, I think if he's your friend, he's your friend, and he doesn't care whether you're a member of the staff of British Airways, stewardess on the aeroplane, or a minister in the government. If he's your friend, he's your friend. And he's a very straightforward person.
Blackpool in October, and one of the most sought-after receptions at the Tory party conference. BA doesn't just give drinks to the Tory party. As a company, it donated £40,000 last year to party funds. Lord King has pledged there will be even more money in the year of the next general election.
These people are in government, hundreds of MPs up at a Tory conference in Blackpool. They haven't got a lot to do during a Tory conference, so you have time to talk to them. You don't do real hard lobbying here. You do that directly in government, to Whitehall or in Parliament. But here you can talk to a lot of people, constituency people, party people. It's called influencing. It's the art of PR, the art of lobbying.
Sidney Chapman, very nice to meet you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's called pressing the flesh. That's what they call it in America. And you watch him walking around a room saying a load of people that he knows, a load of people that he doesn't know. He's good. He's a good operator, good on a personal basis. A very, very hard image on most of television, most of the press, but he has got quite a bit of charm, very good at talking. You can see the way he operates. He's in his element here.
I'm actually with that one.
She's my wife, so, you know. Well, at first glance, you could have done better. Thank you very much. Those were kind words.
I'm available.
I tell you what.
You should turn a blind eye.
Give me your phone number.
You're very good
Turn a
looking.
blind eye.
Every now and then you'll hear a message that rings true.
Yes.
He's helped the Conservative Party on fundraising. So he knows the Conservative Party. He suited his time. He suited the Thatcher years, and he still suits the Thatcher years.
How's it going?
It's a lovely life. I was saying to David, it is absolutely, without question, the best job in the government. It is. I wouldn't say that the Prime Minister, because I would imagine she derives a certain amount of pleasure.
She's got the best job.
She derives a certain amount of pleasure from hers, but it is an absolutely spectacular job. And I mean, there is obviously a handful of people who are trying to kill me, but you know, that's just part of the rich tapestry of life.
If I'd been on the selection committee, you would have been the member for Melton.
Well, I've had a
silly old Charles Rutland, Dennis Lane.
I've had a lovely 12 and a half years as member for the City of London and Westminster South.
When Lord King really wants to get away from boardroom pressures, he comes here to the north of Scotland, where he owns a fishing lodge.
It just causes you to stop and think if you spend a little time up here about all sorts of things. No, it really is exciting. That's the Borgie, that river there. And then if you look over there, just through there, about 8 miles, you'll come to the sea. And then the North Pole, if you want to keep going. It's exciting, the anticipation of coming here. And then one is quite calm and about going back to get on with one's work. But I am in a position that I can come here. Now, some people are not that fortunate. They have to stay where they are.
Had Lord King stayed where he was, he might have spent his life as a manual worker in a small engineering factory. But through his own determination and talent, he's risen to become one of the most influential, non-elected men in Britain. A man who relishes a fight and hardly seems ever to have lost one. He's now nearly 73 years old. Is it time to leave the next fight to another?
Well, I have no intention of retiring. I'm retiring today, but not tomorrow. Having caused this child to be reborn, one is interested to see that it continues into manhood with a great deal of strength in the world marketplace, which it's gaining every day.